It's a tough act to follow. What, no, how many numbers did you get to? 4, 5, 6. Austin and I don't differ too much from each other, except in one respect. I'm much more pessimistic. So I got some thoughts that I want to talk to us about. And the way Austin kind of started out, and I think I agree with a lot. The way we usually think about recessions is we kind of chug along on some certain rate, 2, 3% per year. Something comes along, blindsides us, we go into a recession, and then we kind of work our way back out to go 2, 3% per year going forward. But there's another view of what recessions are. This might be less common, which is in the periods prior to the recession, the economy was going through some period of misallocation or distortions. And in those periods, what happens when the economy corrects, it's not correcting into a period below trend, it's correcting back towards its trend. And think about the recent period during the 2000s. We might have gone through a period, and Austin talked about a little bit of this, and I think most economists are thinking that the 2000s looked weird relative to any other periods of growth. We built a lot of houses. House prices were going up, and as a result, we built a lot of houses. People leveraged those houses, engaged in consumption. They spent too much relative to their income based upon their wealth. Their budget constraint hasn't changed much, especially since the prices of their houses were temporarily inflated. And what happens in those types of situations is you got to pay the piper a little bit. You have to go back and correct some of the things you did during the previous recession. Now, why is that important? Think about those two different types of recessions. The way we usually think about a recession is we go into a recession, and then policymakers, the Federal Reserve, Congress, and presidents use their bullets in their holsters, as Austin said, to try to jumpstart the economy to get back to its trend. The trend is really what it's going for, and it kind of gives it a little push to get there a little quicker. But in recessions where we're correcting back towards the trend, okay, we were overinflated in the pre-period, it's harder for policymakers to push us up when the economy actually wants to go back down. It wants to correct some of those misallocations. And I want us to keep that in mind as we go through some of my talks today, because I'm going to talk about 3 things. And some of you have heard me talk of this is my 5th year. Unfortunately, I've been right on the first 2 a lot, and it makes me worried that I might be right on the 3rd one, because that's going to be my most pessimistic component. I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing market, and we're going to talk about why we shouldn't expect housings to bounce back at all. Okay, there's going to be a fundamental price of housing. We got away from that fundamental price of housing, and we're going to correct back towards that fundamental price of housing. I want to talk a little bit about consumption. As Austin said, usually big recessions lead to big bursts of activity after the end of those recessions. And that is almost exclusively driven by a big burst in consumption. And we didn't see that this time, and I don't think we should have expected to see that this time. And I'll tell us a little bit about why. And I'm going to do those relatively quickly. And then the bulk of my talks is going to be spent on the U.S. labor market. And we're going to ask ourselves a question. Did the consumption, or the construction boom, did the housing boom during the 2000s mask structural problems in the labor market that would have been occurring because of the decline in U.S. manufacturing? And I want us to think about, if that's the case, how do we think about putting low-skilled workers back to work when they exclusively tend to work in manufacturing, which has gone away, in construction, which absorbed them during the 2000s, but is now reverting back to trend. And those are the 3 things we will talk about a little bit. So let's talk first about housing. So these are housing facts, and as Austin said, among economists, we tend to disagree about lots of things, even little things, but I think I've convinced myself that these are truths. I don't know if you guys will as well, but I've convinced myself that these are truths. 3 things, and I got them enumerated so we can not lose track. Okay? The first of those is that the long-run house price appreciation over any sort of period of time, at any level of aggregation, city, state, country, averages about 0 to 2% real. Okay? Bob Schiller at Yale, he's closer to the 0%. I'm going to show you some data that, some periods of time, New York City tends to grow a little bit faster than Des Moines, but not at much faster than 1 to 2% per year. Okay? So 0 to 2% per year is the long-run growth rate in housing. Second, big booms are always followed by big busts. If you go through persistent periods where you're above 0 to 2% per year, you always get some sort of corrections, okay, to take you back to those 0 to 2% per year. And third, and this is very important, when people talk about housing, I've given this kind of talks many years now, When you think about housing, you think about it as God comes down and creates housing prices. Housing prices are set in a market with supply and demand. The demand and supply of housing pin down the price of housing. And as long as you could build over there, where there's nothing, the price of land is always, the price of housing is always pinned down by the price of vacant land somewhere. When New York City gets too expensive, we move to Greenwich. When Greenwich gets too expensive, we move to the suburbs. So supply and demand tend to pin down, and that's what keeps the housing prices at 0 to 2% per year. So let me show you a little bit, and this is just New York City, or this is the state of New York. So this is not only New York City. This includes Buffalo and Albany, the other parts of New York as well. Okay, the less interesting. I'm from Albany, the less interesting parts. And this is the house price appreciation rate at an annual rate in real terms of house prices in New York over periods of time. Why do I show you this picture? I show you this picture because housing prices in New York had a massive bubble in the mid-'80s to the late 1980s, early 1990s. House prices in New York State as a whole increased by 50% between 1984 and 1989. If you take each one of those dots, 10% in 1985, another 10% in 1986, integrate over those, it was 50% between 1984 and 1989. And then what happened in New York? A decade of real housing price declines. What do I mean by real housing price? The house price relative to the CPI. Declined for a decade. And notice, it kind of bounces around. Some years it went up close to 0, and then it went back to 3 or 4. Why? Because house prices were correcting to their long-run trend. And this pattern, and I only use this for illustrative purpose, is found in every sort of housing boom that you see. Big booms followed by persistent and long contractions to get us back to that 0 to 1% real. For comparison, I just want to show the housing growth that occurred in Japan in terms of housing prices from the late 1970s to the late 1980s. An 80% boom in housing prices for the country as a whole, followed by maybe an infinity, I don't know how long it's going out, but a persistent decline in housing prices that has yet to correct in real terms. So people who are looking for a big rebound in housing prices are unlikely to get it. Not only unlikely to get it, economic theory, markets say you shouldn't expect it unless you get another really big demand shock and supply unwinds its position. So I'm going to do a couple of predictions along my talk today. And the prediction one is the way I'm forecasting that we should not, as a group, expect housing to appreciate at more than -4% to 0% over the next 4 to 5 years, unless we're expecting some sort of big housing demand shock to come from someplace that could temporarily take us above our equilibrium trend that we'll eventually have to unwind. And that demand shock will even be more unlikely in a world where there's a glut of housing sitting vacant right now. So for those of us who are looking for a housing rebound, looking for policymakers to prop up the price of housing, you have to remember that I think the equilibrium price of housing is declining, is lower than where we are right now, and we're still trending back towards that. So as a group, we should not expect aggregate housing prices to be, going back anywhere near 2006, 2005 levels. If anything, we might see a contraction again in real terms. The second thing I want to talk to us a little bit about is the expected response of consumption coming out of big recessions. And Austin talked a little bit about this. So I just have, for those of you who are looking at the slides, you can see the first column there is how much GDP was lost during certain 3 big recessions. The current recession, the 1982 recession, and the 1974 recession. So we lost about 3% of production on an annualized basis during that recession. For the 1974 recession, the 1983 recession, the consumption growth, and those are not negatives, those are approximates. The consumption growth in the 4 quarters after the recession ended was about 7%. A little higher in one, a little lower in the other, but big consumption growth during those recessions, and that led to big GDP growth coming out of the recession. This is the big recessions lead to big booms. You kind of basically make up what you lost during the recession and your 3% growth that you normally get during a year. The current recession, the 4 quarters after, these were 4 good quarters after the recession. It's actually moderated a little bit after this time. Consumption only grew at about 2% out of this recession. And as a result, GDP only grew about 2% in the 4 quarters after the recession was growing. It hasn't gotten much above that in the 2.5 years since the recession has ended. Now, why is that? Well, one reason that Austin already talked about, so I'll kind of go quickly. was we went through a period of massive over-leveraging during the 2000s. Savings rates, as you can see here, went to close to zero in 2006. So people were basically consuming all of their income as a country. And that, again, is not sustainable. So what we saw in the recovery, or after the recession started, and the periods of time during the recovery since it was over, is consumers massively increasing their savings rate, trying to re-lever or de-lever their positions. So as a result, we can imagine that the economy isn't chugging along, in part because people are trying to build up a lot of assets that they didn't build up during the 2000 period. And you have to remember now, policymakers, monetary policy and fiscal policy, trying to induce growth through mostly spending, might have less responses in a world where people are trying to de-lever than they are in a period where people aren't trying to de-lever. Another reason why policy responses might have been less effective in trying to really jumpstart the economy, might have prevented depression, but less effective at jumpstarting the economy, stimulating consumption in big growths than it would have been in other periods. So my second prediction, again, is we shouldn't expect this big consumption. If anything, we might just come back to the 2 to 3% growth eventually without going through that big consumption boom that we usually get coming out of recessions. Why? Because people aren't trying to make up what they lost during the recession. They're basically trying to undo what they did in the pre-recessionary periods. And you got a budget constraint that's got to hold. Okay. But I think the most important thing that I want us to talk about today, and this is something that's concerned me more and more, and for those of you who might have seen me give different alumni events over the last few months, I think I'm getting more and more pessimistic as these 4 months go along, is the position of employment for the US economy going forward. Okay, so this is the unemployment rate. You could see during recessions, unemployment rates jump up. Okay? But I think the unemployment rate misses part of where the action's going. So the unemployment rate calculates those people who are looking for a job but are out of work relative to those people looking for a job and out of work plus those people who have a job. There's another group of people out there, the other component of non-employed people who aren't looking for jobs at all. So the unemployment rate, movements in the unemployment rate could come from two sources. Okay. It could come from people exiting unemployment back to jobs, and it could decline as the people who are unemployed exit the labor force. And what I want us to look at, and this is basically the labor force participation rate, this is just for men, over a period of time. Those shaded years are recessions. Okay? What I want us to notice is, during the recent recession, it's kind of a step function. What happens during recessions is a lot of the unemployment rate kind of jumps, or the labor force participation rate, at least for men, has been jumping down during this time period. And this is going to be important. I want us to think about this. And notice there's been a decline, especially since the early 80s, in the labor force participation rate of men. Now, why has that been? Okay. I got 2 minutes? That'll be fine. Okay? Let me just tell you. So before I go into why that's going down, I just want to show you one other thing about the unemployment rate in this recession. The unemployment in this recession is is bifurcated. Most of the unemployed, if we look at it, is basically low-skilled individuals. So yes, the unemployment rate of high-skilled individuals, those with college degrees or more, went from 2 to 4%. So we did get a doubling of the unemployment rate for high-skilled workers. But if we decompose how much of the unemployment rate, that's the last column, is attributed to different skill groups, this recession is basically, in most recessions, are low-skilled workers. Okay? So we have a lot of low-skilled workers out there who are looking for a job. And then we're coupling with the fact that during the last 30 years, but in particular the last 10 years, there's been a sharp decline in manufacturing. Now, why is that important? Most low-skilled workers, or at least low-skilled men workers, work in the manufacturing industry. About 20-some% of them, a third to a quarter of them work in manufacturing. Manufacturing's declined. Now, what normally happens when manufacturing declines is low-skilled workers have exited the labor force. So part of the reason we've seen the labor force participation rate of men falling is there's been a decline in the demand for low-skilled workers, a decline in manufacturing. It's driven down the wages of low-skilled workers, and low-skilled workers are choosing not to work at those prevailing wages, instead choose to stay home. Now, in this recent period, and this will be my last set of comment, in this recent period, and that's the blue line, the red line's the manufacturing from before, the blue line is construction. During the 2000s, when manufacturing has been declining, when low-skilled men normally would be exiting the labor force as manufacturing is declining and their wages were falling, construction boomed. So as construction boomed, it absorbed, because low-skilled men are fairly substitutable between manufacturing and construction, the skill base. If you look at low-skilled men, they tend to move back and forth primarily from manufacturing and construction. That makes about 50% of all low-skilled men employed work in one of those two sectors. Construction absorbed these workers. And now the question we want to ask ourselves is, as construction returns back to trend and manufacturing disappears, what do we expect low-skilled men, what sector to absorb low-skilled men going forward? And part of what I'm concerned about is what we're seeing now is just the 2000s decline in manufacturing was masked by the run-up in construction, and now we have this big segment of the population with very few job outcomes that are sitting in the unemployment pool, and instead of getting the unemployment rate down over time by them being reabsorbed by the labor force, the unemployment rate starts to go down from them exiting the labor force. And as Austin said, the unemployment rate has been going down, but part of that is because people have been exiting out of unemployment to non-employment. What are we going to do with these low-skilled men going forward? And I think that's something as a country that I think is hard for traditional policy aspects to think about. So this is my just last conclusion slide. This recession, I think, is a little bit different than other recessions in the sense that we're not just deviating from trend. With the misallocation that occurred in the 2000s, we have to work our way through. Okay? We built too many houses, we spent a lot of money, and basically we absorbed workers into sectors that normally wouldn't have been absorbed into absent the construction boom. And how do we think about policy in this type of environment, I think, is an important kind of thing to keep in mind when we're designing policies in the current environment. That's all I got.